When 82-year-old Ruth started giving away her jewelry to neighbours, her daughter thought she was just being generous. 3 months later, Ruth passed peacefully in her sleep. What if I told you there were 4 other signs her family missed that could have given them precious extra time together? Today, I'm sharing the 5 subtle signs that an elderly person may be in their final months. Signs that even doctors sometimes overlook, but that could change everything for your family. Ruth had always been the heart of her family, hosting Sunday dinners, tending her rose garden, and calling her grandchildren every Tuesday without fail. After losing her husband of 58 years, everyone expected some changes, but Ruth seemed to be coping remarkably well. She still drove to the grocery store, maintained her spotless home, and never missed her weekly bridge game with the ladies. But then her daughter Sarah began noticing something different. Ruth, who once treasured her late husband's favourite armchair, suddenly couldn't bear to sit in the living room. The woman who prided herself on her appearance started wearing the same sweater 3 days in a row. Most puzzling of all, Ruth began insisting that Sarah take home family heirlooms, saying, "Because they'll just collect dust here." These weren't dramatic changes, they were whispers of something deeper happening. Have you noticed changes like this in someone you love? Changes so subtle you wondered if you were imagining them? If this resonates with you, please hit that like button and subscribe, because recognizing these signs could give you the gift of time. The first sign that something deeper was happening with Ruth became clear during what should have been a joyful family gathering. Ruth's granddaughter had just gotten engaged, and the whole family gathered to celebrate. But instead of being her usual animated self, asking a dozen questions about wedding plans and offering to help with preparations, Ruth sat quietly in the corner, barely participating in conversations that would normally energize her for weeks. This wasn't just typical grief or having a bad day. Ruth, who had been the family's social coordinator for decades, suddenly began declining invitations she would never have missed before. Her weekly bridge game became bi-weekly, then monthly, then not at all. The woman who used to call her neighbours just to check in stopped answering her phone, letting calls go to voicemail even when she was clearly home. Here's what makes this particularly challenging to recognise. We often dismiss social withdrawal as normal aging or a natural grief response. But there's a crucial difference between temporary withdrawal and this deeper pulling away. Normal grief comes in waves, good days and bad days. What Ruth was experiencing was different, a consistent, gradual disconnection from the social connections that had previously brought her joy. The key indicators to watch for include suddenly cancelling plans they previously kept religiously, avoiding phone calls from people they used to enjoy talking with, showing disinterest in activities that once brought them pleasure, and most tellingly, seeming emotionally distant even when physically present with family and friends. This withdrawal isn't about depression or loneliness in the traditional sense. It's something more profound, a natural turning inward that often signals the beginning of an internal preparation process. Ruth wasn't avoiding people because she didn't care about them anymore. She was unconsciously beginning to separate from worldly attachments. What social changes have you observed in your elderly loved ones? Have you noticed them pulling back from activities or relationships that once meant everything to them? But this next sign is even more telling, and it's one that families often misinterpret as a positive development. The second sign manifested in Ruth's kitchen, a place that had always been her sanctuary. For 60 years, Ruth had cooked elaborate meals, famous for her Sunday pot roasts and homemade apple pies that neighbours would smell from 3 houses away. But Sarah began noticing that Ruth's refrigerator, once bursting with fresh ingredients, now contained only basic necessities: milk, bread, and a few frozen dinners. When Sarah asked about it, Ruth simply said she didn't feel like cooking for just one person anymore. This seemed reasonable at first. Many widowed elderly people struggle with motivation to prepare full meals, But then Sarah discovered something more concerning. Ruth wasn't just cooking less, she was eating significantly less overall. Ruth had always been a woman who enjoyed her food, savouring each meal and often commenting on flavours and textures. Now she would pick at a small portion, leaving most of her plate untouched, claiming she was just not that hungry anymore. Her clothes began fitting loosely, and when Sarah mentioned the weight loss, Ruth dismissed it as finally losing those extra pounds I've carried for years. Here's the critical distinction families need to understand. There's a difference between reduced appetite due to medication side effects, dental problems, or depression, and this deeper physiological shift. When someone is in their final months, their body often naturally begins requiring less sustenance. It's not that they're choosing not to eat, their cellular metabolism is actually slowing down, and their body's nutritional needs are genuinely decreasing. The physical signs to monitor include consistently eating less than half of normal portion sizes, showing little interest in previously favourite foods, complaining that food doesn't taste the same anymore, experiencing unintentional weight loss of more than 5% of body weight over 3 months, and having difficulty finishing even small meals despite claiming to feel hungry. But here's what makes this particularly complex. These changes can also indicate treatable conditions like medication interactions, digestive issues, or dental problems. The key difference is consistency and the person's response to intervention. If offering favourite foods, addressing potential dental discomfort, or reviewing medications doesn't restore appetite, and if the person seems genuinely satisfied with smaller portions rather than frustrated by their lack of hunger, this may signal something deeper. Ruth's daughter tried everything, bringing her favourite Chinese takeout, baking her beloved chocolate chip cookies, even setting up family dinner dates. While Ruth appreciated these gestures, she consistently ate very little, and importantly, she didn't seem distressed by her reduced appetite. She appeared content with smaller portions, almost as if her body was naturally downsizing its needs. Have you noticed eating pattern changes in your elderly loved ones? Perhaps they're leaving favourite foods untouched, or seem satisfied with portions that would have left them hungry before. The third sign revealed itself through Ruth's changing relationship with sleep, and it's one that fooled even her doctor initially. Ruth had always been an early riser, up at 6:30 sharp, brewing coffee and reading the morning paper before anyone else in the neighbourhood stirred. Her energy carried her through busy days of gardening, housework and social activities, and she rarely napped unless she was recovering from illness. But over several weeks, Sarah noticed Ruth's schedule shifting dramatically. Phone calls that once happened at 8 in the morning were now being returned at noon, with Ruth apologising that she had overslept again. Ruth began taking afternoon naps that stretched from 30 minutes to 2 or 3 hours. Most concerning of all, Ruth started going to bed much earlier, sometimes as early as 7 in the evening, yet still seemed tired throughout the day. When Sarah expressed concern, Ruth brushed it off, saying she was finally catching up on all the sleep I missed over the years. Her doctor initially agreed, suggesting that elderly people often need more rest and that Ruth might be recovering from the stress of losing her husband. But this wasn't the rejuvenating sleep of recovery. It was something fundamentally different. Here's what distinguishes normal age-related sleep changes from this deeper shift. Healthy elderly people might sleep lighter or wake more frequently, but they typically feel refreshed after adequate rest. What Ruth was experiencing was a profound increase in sleep need combined with persistent fatigue that rest couldn't relieve. The concerning patterns to watch for include needing significantly more sleep than their historical normal. We're talking about increases of 3 to 4 hours daily, not just 30 minutes more. Look for frequent napping when they previously didn't nap, or naps that extend well beyond typical power nap duration. Watch for going to bed much earlier than their lifetime pattern, yet still waking up tired. Most tellingly, observe if they seem low energy, even after what should be adequate sleep. Ruth's fatigue wasn't the kind that comes from physical exertion or poor sleep quality. She would wake from a full night's sleep plus an afternoon nap and still move slowly, speak more softly, and seem to lack the inner vitality that had always characterized her. Simple tasks like folding laundry or watering plants, which never fazed her before, now seemed to require significant effort and multiple rest breaks. The key distinction is that this fatigue doesn't improve with more rest. When someone is simply overtired or recovering from illness, additional sleep restores their energy levels. But when someone is in their final months, their body is redirecting energy away from daily activities toward internal processes. No amount of sleep fully replenishes their energy because their system is naturally conserving resources. Ruth's family initially celebrated when she started taking better care of herself by resting more. They encouraged her increased sleep, thinking it was healthy self-care. But what they were witnessing was her body's wisdom in preparing for transition, a natural slowing down that couldn't be reversed through lifestyle changes or medical interventions. Another telltale sign was Ruth's changing relationship with activities that once energized her. Tending her roses, which used to invigorate her spirit, now left her needing to sit and rest afterward. Phone conversations with old friends, previously a source of joy and energy, began feeling like tasks that drained her rather than filled her up. What sleep changes concern you most in your elderly loved ones? Have you noticed them needing dramatically more rest yet still seeming tired, or losing energy from activities that once brought them vitality? The fourth sign appeared in Ruth's mind, and it's perhaps the most misunderstood of all the indicators. Ruth had always been sharp as a tack, balancing her checkbook to the penny, remembering everyone's birthdays without a calendar, and, well, beating her grandchildren at word games. Her mental acuity was something the family took pride in, often saying, "Grandma's memory is better than ours." But Sarah began noticing something puzzling. Ruth would have moments of confusion that seemed to come from nowhere. Forgetting familiar names, losing track of conversations mid-sentence, or just staring blankly when asked simple questions. Yet just hours later, she'd be completely lucid, discussing complex family matters with perfect clarity or recalling detailed stories from decades past with remarkable precision. These weren't the progressive, consistent changes associated with dementia or Alzheimer's disease. Instead, Ruth experienced what can best be described as cognitive waves, periods of mental fog followed by stretches of complete clarity. During clear moments, Ruth was entirely herself, aware of her confusion episodes and often apologizing for them, saying things like, "I don't know where my mind went," or "I feel like I'm not all here today." This fluctuation is critically different from neurodegenerative diseases. With dementia, cognitive decline typically follows a more predictable pattern of gradual worsening. What Ruth experienced was more like her consciousness was beginning to shift between different states, sometimes fully present in the physical world, sometimes seeming to exist partially elsewhere. The specific patterns to recognize include sudden moments of disorientation in familiar environments, like momentarily not recognizing their own home or forgetting where they are. Watch for difficulty following conversations they could easily handle days before, but then displaying remarkable mental sharpness hours later. Notice if they seem to drift away mentally during conversations, as if their attention is being pulled towards something unseen. Ruth would sometimes stop mid-sentence and look around with a confused expression, as if she'd forgotten not just what she was saying, but where she was entirely. Then, without any apparent trigger, she'd snap back to full awareness and continue the conversation as if nothing had happened. Family members found these episodes deeply unsettling because they highlighted just how unpredictable and temporary these mental shifts were. What made this particularly challenging was Ruth's awareness during her clear periods. Unlike someone with advancing dementia who might not recognize their cognitive changes, Ruth was fully conscious of her fluctuations. She would express frustration, saying, "I feel like my mind is playing tricks on me," or "Sometimes I feel like I'm here," and "Sometimes I feel like I'm somewhere else entirely." Another distinctive aspect was the content of her confusion. Rather than simply forgetting recent events or struggling with familiar tasks, Ruth sometimes seemed confused about time itself. She would mention deceased relatives as if they were still alive, not because she'd forgotten they'd passed, but as if the boundaries between past and present were becoming less distinct for her. The medical community sometimes misses this sign because these fluctuations can be attributed to medication effects, urinary tract infections, or early-stage dementia. But when comprehensive medical evaluations rule out these causes, and when the person maintains insight into their episodes during clear periods, it often indicates something deeper, a natural loosening of consciousness's tight grip on present-moment awareness. Ruth's family learned to work with these fluctuations rather than fighting them. During her clear periods, they had meaningful conversations and made important decisions together. During foggy periods, they offered gentle reassurance without trying to force clarity or becoming frustrated when Ruth seemed mentally absent. How do you handle these moments when your elderly loved ones seem mentally present one moment and distant the next? Have you noticed them drifting between states of clarity and confusion in ways that don't match typical aging patterns? The fifth and most profound sign emerged through Ruth's conversations and inner world, revealing a deep spiritual and emotional preparation that many families find both beautiful and heartbreaking to witness. This wasn't about religious beliefs or formal spirituality. It was something far more universal and instinctive. Ruth began having conversations that her family had never heard from her before. During what seemed like casual visits, she started sharing detailed memories from her childhood, telling stories about her parents and grandparents with vivid clarity. But these weren't just nostalgic reminiscences. They felt like Ruth was creating a complete narrative of her life, as if she was mentally organizing and reviewing her entire existence. She began expressing things she had never verbalized before. Ruth told her daughter how proud she was of the woman Sarah had become, sharing specific memories of Sarah's childhood accomplishments that had clearly meant more to Ruth than anyone realized. She called her grandchildren individually, not for any special occasion, but to tell them exactly what they meant to her and how they had enriched her life. Most significantly, Ruth started talking about her deceased husband with a different quality of longing. Rather than the grief-stricken missing that characterized her early widowhood, she began speaking about him as if she expected to see him again soon. She would say things like, "Your grandfather is probably wondering where I am, or I feel like he's waiting for me." These weren't statements of despair. They carried a sense of anticipation, almost excitement. The behaviors that accompany this inner preparation are distinctive and powerful. Ruth began organizing her possessions with unusual intentionality, not just giving things away, but carefully considering who should receive each meaningful item. She would hold her mother's jewelry box and say, "This should go to Sarah because she always admired it," or give her husband's watch to her grandson with detailed stories about its significance. Ruth also started seeking closure in relationships. She reached out to people she hadn't spoken to in years, an old friend from decades past, a distant cousin, even a neighbor she'd had a minor disagreement with. These weren't dramatic reconciliations, but gentle completions, as if she was ensuring no relationships were left unfinished. Perhaps most remarkably, Ruth began displaying an unusual sense of peace about her own mortality. She started making comments like, "I've had a good life," or "I'm not afraid anymore," but not in a depressed or resigned way. Instead, she seemed to radiate a quiet acceptance and even anticipation that puzzled her family. The conversations that signal this preparation often include detailed life reviews where they share memories and stories with unusual completeness, expressions of love and gratitude that feel like they're saying goodbye without explicitly saying it, mentions of deceased loved ones as if reunion is imminent, discussions about what happens after death without fear or anxiety, and statements about feeling ready or at peace in ways they've never expressed before. Ruth's family initially worried these conversations indicated depression or giving up. But Ruth's demeanor suggested something entirely different. She seemed lighter, more at peace, and paradoxically more present in some ways, even as she was preparing to leave. She laughed more easily, seemed less concerned with trivial daily stresses, and focused intensely on what truly mattered to her. One of the most touching aspects was Ruth's newfound ability to be completely authentic in her relationships. She stopped worrying about social conventions or protecting others' feelings in small ways. If she was tired, she said so. If she loved someone, she told them directly. This wasn't rudeness. It was the profound honesty that comes when someone realizes time is precious and superficiality no longer serves any purpose. Have you had these conversations with your elderly loved ones? Those moments when they share their life story with unusual depth, express love with surprising intensity, or speak about death and what comes after with unexpected peace rather than fear. Once Sarah recognized these 5 signs for what they truly were, not problems to fix, but natural preparations for Ruth's final journey. Everything changed for their family. Instead of worrying about Ruth's decreased appetite, they focused on sharing her favorite tea together each afternoon. Rather than pushing Ruth to be more social, they honored her need for quiet reflection while ensuring she felt deeply loved and supported. Sarah stopped trying to convince Ruth to eat more and instead sat with her during smaller meals, using that time for intimate conversations. When Ruth had cognitive fluctuations, Sarah learned to be present with her wherever Ruth's mind was traveling, rather than pulling her back to full alertness. Most importantly, when Ruth shared her life stories and expressions of love, Sarah listened with her whole heart, understanding these weren't just random conversations, but precious gifts. The 3 months they had together became the most meaningful time their family had ever shared. Ruth was able to complete her emotional preparations, surrounded by understanding rather than concern. She distributed her treasured possessions with joy instead of sadness, knowing her family comprehended the significance. Her final weeks were filled with gentle closure, honest conversations, and the deep peace that comes when someone feels truly seen and supported in their transition. Ruth passed exactly as she had been preparing to, peacefully, with dignity, surrounded by love. Her family's grief was profound, but it was clean grief, without the regret and unfinished business that haunts so many families who miss these subtle signs until it's too late. If recognizing these signs could give you precious time with someone you love, please hit that like button right now and share this video with family members who need to see it. Your sharing could help another family recognize these subtle changes before it's too late. Share your experience in the comments. Have you noticed any of these 5 signs in your elderly loved ones? Your story could provide comfort and guidance to other families navigating this difficult journey.